This is Democracy Watch. I'm joined by my co-host, voting rights attorney, Marc Elias. So, Marc, obviously a huge day here. We have Trump's third indictment for the January 6th case, the January 6th and stolen election case, everything encompassed within that. First off, can you speak about the charges that were included within this indictment?
Yeah, this is a really, really rock solid indictment. The government, oftentimes has to decide how big or how narrow to go. And here they brought a 4-count indictment, right? So they didn't try to lard on 8 counts or 20 counts. They brought 4 counts. The first is 18 U.S.C. 371, which is conspiracy to defraud the United States. Pretty vanilla, basic charge. You see that in a lot of cases that have come before the courts around January 6th. It's also a routinely charged case anytime you involve a conspiracy involving the government. The second is 18 U.S.C. 1512. This is conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding. And I know we're going to talk more about that. This relates to the electors and what happened on January 6th. The third is 18 U.S.C. 1512C, a different part of the same provision that deals with obstruction and attempt to obstruct an official proceeding. And then finally, I think probably the most interesting charge here is 18 U.S.C. section 241, which is a conspiracy against rights. This is essentially a post-Civil War statute that was put in place in large measure in response to the Ku Klux Klan and efforts to essentially deprive people of their right to vote.
Now, the indictment basically serves as a roadmap. Obviously, these aren't all the charges. We'll know what the charges are during the arraignment. And as is the case with the stolen classified documents, we could also see a superseding indictment. But this indictment right here is a roadmap. So what is the government's theory as to how they're looking to prosecute this case?
Yeah, so the government's theory is really straightforward. And I think that speaks really well of the department and, frankly, real trouble for Donald Trump. And potentially, we could talk about later some of these co-conspirators. But the government's theory is straightforward, which is that Donald Trump, shortly after the 2020 election, knew he lost. He was told he lost. He was repeatedly told he lost. Nevertheless, he continued to persist in claiming that he didn't lose. And that involved sending his lawyers into court to make various outrageous claims and fanciful legal theories. And they lay out a series of states, Georgia, Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, where those claims were advanced. And he employed a conspiracy with lawyers to push forward these false claims, even when he knew and they knew that they had lost. After those court cases didn't pan out, it then went to its next phase, which was the fake electors, right? Essentially, more people joined the conspiracy to try to have these fake slates of electors submit fake certificates as if they had been selected. When that didn't pan out, then it went even further to trying to get the vice president to not do his constitutional obligation certifying the election. And then finally, in the final act of this indictment, it plays out on January 6th with the president of the United States encouraging, again, himself directly and through these co-conspirators, an effort to continue the conspiracy forward. And we all know what happened on January 6th.
Now, there are 6 other unnamed co-conspirators in this indictment. Do we have any indication as to who they are? And as a follow-up to that, you did speak about how the fake elector scheme was a big element of this. So if there are only 6 unnamed co-conspirators, but we have the fake elector scheme as a big element of this indictment, wouldn't there be a far greater number because those fake electors would also be included?
So again, I want to give the Department of Justice real credit here. And by Department of Justice, I really mean the special counsel's office. Real credit here for not overcharging this case, right? What they did is they focused in on 6 people who are senior people. Now, interestingly, Brian, 5 of the 6 are Republican lawyers. Okay, so these are not people who, may have gotten enticed into signing their name on a piece of paper they shouldn't have, not to excuse those fake electors, but these are the people who orchestrated this. So we don't know exactly who they are because they're not named, but it's pretty clear co-conspirator 1 is almost certainly Rudy Giuliani. This is an attorney who, in the words of the indictment, is willing to spread knowing false claims and pursue strategies that Donald Trump's 2020 reelection campaign attorneys would not. So we know from the background that's Donald Trump. We are pretty sure co-conspirator 2, this is the person who tried to leverage the vice president into not following the law. We think this is probably John Eastman. Number 3, a little open for a question. This is an attorney who made unfounded claims and who the president privately acknowledged sounded crazy.
That should narrow it down.
I was going to say, so this is a lawyer who made crazy claims.
Yeah.
I could guess who that is. I think co-conspirator 4, though, is a really interesting one, because co-conspirator 4 is a Department of Justice official, who with the president attempted to use the Justice Department to open sham criminal investigations. That sounds an awful lot like Jeffrey Clark, as you recall, who we saw later had his house searched. So
and those who Trump wanted to make the attorney general.
Correct. And that seems to be spelled out in the indictment, which is why I say that my suspicion is that Jeffrey Clark. We don't know that those are who those 4 are, but that appears to be pretty good evidence.
Yeah. And by the way, what does it say that Trump tried to appoint as the attorney general someone who may very well be one of the unnamed co-conspirators in this very indictment about Trump's efforts to overturn an American election?
Look, I think it's chilling. I think it is chilling that what you have here is a conspiracy of lawyers, of people, some of whom, like Rudy Giuliani, was a public figure trusted by millions of Americans because of his time as U.S. attorney and as mayor, and others like Jeffrey Clark, who were trusted because they took an oath of office to uphold the U.S. Constitution. Others like John Eastman, who were viewed as constitutional scholars. So the Republican bar is going to have a lot of explaining to do when this is over, because they have promulgated a series of lawyers that we've seen over time who were willing to cast aside their professional obligations and their obligations as citizens, and in some instances, their oaths of office, in order to essentially join in a conspiracy with the president of the United States to overthrow a free and fair election.
Convictions aside, what can happen to these people who do have the ability to practice law, for example, who've used their positions of power to basically abuse the system? Regardless of what we can expect on the conviction side, what about their ability to continue practicing the law?
Yeah, so I think 2 things. First of all, none of these people have been indicted.
Right.
They're all unindicted co-conspirators. But remember, we saw recently a superseding indictment in the Florida case. And superseding indictments means that the indictment gets replaced by a new indictment. And prosecutors do that to do one of two things. They either do it to add new charges, which we saw in Florida, right? They added an additional charge, but they can also do it to add new defendants. And we saw that also in the Florida case. So I'm not here to say that any of these 6 people are going to be the subject of a superseding indictment, but I sure wouldn't want to be sitting in their shoes right now as Jack Smith prepares this case. But even if they're not indicted, even if that does not come to pass and they remain unindicted co-conspirators, and by the way, 1 or more of them could be cooperating with Jack Smith for all we know, and that's why they're unindicted. But even if they're not indicted, all of these people are going to face serious bar challenges because their license to practice law does not give them a license to conspire to overturn an election. And in fact, several of the people we just mentioned, we know have already been the subject of bar proceedings. We know Rudy Giuliani has faced disciplinary action. We know Eastman is in the middle of disciplinary action in Florida. And we know that several of the other lawyers associated with Trump have faced that as well.
Now, as part of the indictment, a senior Trump advisor in 2020 had emailed, and I want to read the contents of this email that were included in the indictment because I think you'll find them interesting. When our research and campaign legal team can't back up any of the claims made by our elite strike force legal team, you can see why we're 0 for 32 on our cases. I'll obviously hustle to help on all fronts, but it's tough to own any of this when it's all just conspiracy shit beamed down from the mothership. Now, those 32 losses would eventually balloon to over 60 losses, and many of them were at the hands of you and your legal team. So how does a quote like that, I guess, what's your reaction to a quote like that? And beyond that, how does a quote like that impact Trump's defense in this case?
So what's interesting is they were only halfway there.
Right.
At 32, they were like, it's halftime, guys. Let's keep going, right? Because they wind up losing over 60 cases. And it is surreal to see it in writing because at the time, it's easy now to look back and have everyone say, well, they brought these lawsuits and they lost. But at the time, we were dealing with these in rapid fire succession, and it wasn't clear where they were going to end. It just wasn't clear. Like, we had the law on our side, we had the facts on our side, but all they had to do is convince a judge in a Georgia courtroom or a judge in a Wisconsin courtroom, and things could look very different. So to know that they knew at the time that these lawsuits were frivolous, I think is a really, really troubling thing to think about. A lot of operatives and lawyers, like a lot of people, had to know that this was nonsense. And yet at 32, they didn't stop. It went to 40 and 50 and 60. So, it's very, very troubling, whether part of a criminal case or not.
And just, I guess, what does it feel like to have personally been such a huge part of this? I mean, again, this is a reference to a lot of the cases that you yourself and your team brought. I mean, and ultimately, like, look where they ended up. I mean, it's that quote itself was used in an indictment against Trump for, arguably one of the most heinous crimes against this country in its history.
Yeah. So look, I look at the indictment, and as I read it, they talked about the lawsuits in Arizona. And I was like, yep, I remember those. They talk about the lawsuits in Georgia. I'm like, yep, I remember those. They talk about the lawsuits in Pennsylvania and in Michigan and in Wisconsin and elsewhere. And it is just surreal. And then you see that quote, and I just think, God, we were worried about the fate of free and fair elections and democracy, and they knew it was bullshit.
Yeah.
And they knew it was bullshit, and they were putting the country through it anyway. That's just like a whole other level.
Yeah. Well, we'll leave it there. With that said, obviously, I speak on behalf of everybody in saying thank you for the work that you and your team have done. Obviously, it's resulted in large part the indictment that we're seeing today. So for those watching, if you want to support Marc and his team, make sure to sign up for Democracy Docket. It's a news outlet focused on voting rights and elections. I'll put the link right here on the screen. It's also in the post description of this video. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Marc Elias.
This is Democracy Watch.